People said James Murphree was a man of cold iron and unyielding silence. From the high rises of Manhattan to the expansive estates of Connecticut, his name was synonymous with a power that never flinched. But all of that power felt like ash the moment Sophie started to wail. The gala was meant to be a masterpiece of new power, a display of marble, crystal chandeliers, and the scent of expensive lilies. Guests in deep burgundy and emerald silks moved through the ballroom, celebrating another Murphree triumph. Everything was calm and curated, exactly as James demanded, until the silence shattered. It wasn't a cry for attention or a fussy toddler's hunger. It was the sound of a heart breaking wide open, a raw, frantic scream of pure recognition. James moved instinctively, reaching for his daughter in her sharp blue suit, his hands, usually so steady, now trembling as he tried to soothe her. She had been a ghost for 3 months, a silent halo of curls that hadn't uttered a sound since her mother's funeral. Doctors in New York called it trauma. Specialists in Texas spoke of emotional withdrawal. James knew it was simply a world without a light. But tonight, Sophie wasn't looking at the father who could buy her anything. Her small, desperate eyes were locked onto a woman standing near the periphery, a maid in a stark orange and white uniform, her yellow-gloved hands frozen mid-motion. Her name was Pamela Jones. To the elite guests, she was invisible, just another part of the background service. Sophie reached out, her tiny hands grasping at the air. Then she twisted with such force that she slipped from James's arms and hit the floor. The room gasped in a collective shock, but Sophie didn't cry from the fall. She crawled with a desperate, frantic speed across the marble, her breath coming in broken gasps as if she were running for her life. The string quartet continued to play, but the music was dead to everyone watching. Sophie reached Pamela and threw her small arms around the maid's legs, clinging to her as if she were the only solid ground left in a sinking world. Pamela dropped to her knees, her eyes wide with a terror that matched the child's, her hands hovering as if afraid to touch the billionaire's daughter would seal her own fate. And then the impossible happened. Sophie's voice, raspy from months of disuse, but loud enough to pierce the heart of every person in that room, broke the silence. "Help her, Daddy!" The words sliced through the gala like a blade. A guest dropped a glass of champagne, another covered their mouth in horror. James felt the breath leave his lungs. His daughter hadn't spoken a word in 90 days, and now her first plea wasn't for comfort or for him. It was a demand for justice for a stranger in a maid's uniform. Before you begin, please take a moment to relax and enjoy the story. If you find it engaging, do me a small favor. Subscribe, like, and share to support the channel. I'd also love to hear from you, so feel free to comment and tell me where you're watching from. Your support means a lot and helps grow our community. The string quartet faltered as the crystal tray shattered, but the silence that followed was louder. James Murphree watched in paralyzed shock as his daughter, Sophie, scrambled across the marble floor. Her small hands gripped Pamela Jones' uniform, her face streaked with tears. Then the miracle happened. The girl who hadn't spoken since the funeral gasped for air and pointed a trembling finger. "Help her, Daddy," she rasped, her voice piercing the elite crowd. James felt his heart stop. His daughter's first words weren't for him, but a desperate plea for the invisible maid. Back in the cold sanctuary of his office, James ran Pamela's name through every high-level database he owned, but the screen remained hauntingly blank. No birth certificate, no social security number, not even a tax trail. Pamela Jones was a ghost moving through his halls. When he finally cornered her, she didn't flinch. She admitted the truth with a hollow gaze. She had erased her existence to survive a predator. James realized then that the woman his daughter clung to wasn't just a maid, she was a fugitive hiding in plain sight. The heavy scent of Victor Vance's expensive cologne signaled danger before he even spoke. He stood in the study, a predator in a tailored suit, eyes fixed on the garden where Pamela sat with Sophie. "She's a liability, James," Vance purred, his smile never reaching his eyes. He laid the merger papers on the desk, a multi-billion-dollar empire within reach, on one condition. He wanted the maid handled quietly. James felt the chill of a devil's bargain. The man offering him the world was the same monster his daughter was begging him to fight. The fallout was instantaneous and brutal, a coordinated strike that began with a single headline. By dawn, the story of James Murphree's emotional instability had saturated the financial news cycles, painting a picture of a broken titan who had lost his grip on reality. Victor Vance had weaponized the gala's chaos, leaking twisted accounts of James harboring a troubled, undocumented servant at the expense of his company's stability. The whispers in the corridors of power grew into a roar. People who had toasted his success the night before were now scrambling to distance themselves from his impending ruin. James stood before the floor-to-ceiling windows of his office, watching the tickers as his net worth began to bleed out in real time. His phone buzzed incessantly with notifications of pulled investments and canceled contracts. A primary group from Texas withdrew $50 million before the markets even opened, citing a lack of confidence in his judgment. Then came the calls from New York, partners he had known for decades sounding like strangers as they spoke of liability and reputational risk. The boardroom, once his kingdom, had become a battlefield where his past victories meant nothing in the face of Vance's calculated smear campaign. Through the heavy oak doors, he could hear the frantic pace of his assistants trying to contain the fire, but there was no containing a lie that people wanted to believe. The narrative was too perfect. A grieving widower, a silent child, and a mysterious maid. It was the kind of scandal that investors loathed and the public devoured. His board chairman called with an ultimatum, his voice cold and devoid of their usual camaraderie, warning James that if the maid situation wasn't resolved by the end of the day, they would move to strip him of his CEO title. Despite the walls closing in, James turned his back on the glowing screens. He looked toward the nursery where Sophie's laughter, a sound more precious than any stock price, filtered through the hallway. He realized that Vance wasn't just trying to take his money, he was trying to force James to choose between his empire and his integrity. The boardroom war had begun, and for the first time in his life, James Murphree was prepared to lose it all if it meant keeping the promise he had seen in his daughter's eyes. James Murphree sat in the dim light of his study, the only sound the low hum of a secure laptop, as Marcus Reed, a man whose expertise lay in uncovering what the world wanted buried, bypassed layer after layer of encrypted firewalls. The ghost that was Pamela Jones began to materialize not as a fugitive, but as a martyr of truth. As the code scrolled by, Marcus revealed the digital remains of a life Victor Vance had meticulously incinerated. Pamela wasn't just a maid, she was the lead investigative journalist who had nearly toppled Vance's offshore empire 3 years ago. She had been the whistleblower with a file so explosive it would have triggered a federal collapse of Vance's entire network. But before she could publish, the predator had struck back. James leaned in, his jaw tightening as he read the logs of how Vance had systematically dismantled her existence. He hadn't just fired her, he had framed her for a high-level embezzlement scheme, bribed officials in Seattle and Los Angeles to falsify police reports, and eventually used his political ties in Washington to ensure her disappearance. The invisible evidence showed a trail of intimidated witnesses and a series of accidents that had claimed the lives of her closest sources. Pamela had erased her own identity not out of guilt, but as the final desperate move in a game of survival against a man who owned the very systems meant to protect her. Looking at the grainy photos of the woman Pamela used to be, confident, sharp, and standing outside a courthouse, James saw the same fire he now saw in her eyes when she looked at Sophie. The files Marcus unearthed contained copies of the original documents Pamela had managed to keep hidden in a dead-drop server, bank transfers, signed affidavits, and proof of Vance's human trafficking connections that spanned from Texas to New York. This was the invisible evidence that Vance feared. It was the reason he was currently strangling James's business interests. He wasn't just trying to handle a maid, he was trying to bury the only living witness to his crimes. James felt a cold, righteous anger settle in his chest, replacing the last of his hesitation. He looked at the mountain of data that could destroy his business rival and realized that his daughter's intuition had been flawless. Sophie hadn't just seen a maid. She had recognized a soul fighting the same darkness that had tried to swallow their own family. As Marcus prepped the files for a final, lethal strike, James knew the war had shifted. He was no longer just protecting a servant, he was arming a revolutionary. The tension within the Murphree estate reached a suffocating peak as the first of the black and whites pulled into the long, winding driveway. Victor Vance had stopped hiding behind boardroom maneuvers and had begun utilizing the badge as his personal scalpel. James watched from the security monitors as two officers, their faces set in masks of practiced concern, stepped onto his porch for the third wellness check in 48 hours. They weren't there to serve the public. They were the hounds sent to sniff out a weakness and rattle Pamela until she broke. Each visit was a psychological siege, a 72-hour cycle designed to make the estate feel less like a fortress and more like a cage. The officers spoke in low, suggestive tones to Pamela, mentioning unresolved discrepancies and voluntary protective custody, their eyes roaming the foyer for any excuse to place her in cuffs. It was a baiting tactic. They wanted her to panic, to flee the sanctuary of James's protection, and bolt into the waiting shadows where Vance's private team was stationed just beyond the property line. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with the scent of ozone and unspilled rain. James stood in the hallway, his presence a silent barrier between the law and the woman his daughter refused to let go. He could see the toll it was taking on Pamela. Her knuckles were white as she gripped the railing, her eyes darting toward the exits every time a floorboard creaked. The trap was closing, fueled by fabricated reports of her instability and anonymous tips that James was harboring a fugitive against her will. Even Sophie seemed to sense the encroaching darkness. She clung to Pamela's hand with a strength that defied her small stature, her eyes fixed on the officers with a haunting, knowing stare. Every knock on the door was a reminder that Vance owned the streets, the precincts, and the narrative. James knew that if he allowed Pamela to succumb to the fear, if she stepped even a foot past his gate to escape the scrutiny, the wellness check would turn into a permanent disappearance. He leaned into the ear of his head of security, his voice a cold rasp, ordering the gates locked and the jamming frequencies activated. They were in the heart of the trap now, and the only way out was to hold the line until the predator was forced to step into the light himself. The silence of the penthouse was shattered by Elena's sharp, frantic ultimatum. Draped in silk and smelling of status, his fiancé demanded James cast Pamela out to save their crumbling social standing in Manhattan. She spoke of ruined reputations and lost board seats, her eyes cold with the logic of the elite. James looked from Elena's calculated fury to the floor, where Sophie sat peacefully, her small hand safely tucked in Pamela's. He didn't hesitate. He chose the light in his daughter's eyes over a seat at the table, realizing that a kingdom built on betrayal wasn't worth ruling. Midnight turned the estate into a battlefield as Vance's extraction team breached the outer perimeter, their black SUVs cutting through the fog like sharks. James stood at the iron gates, his pulse a steady drum of war, flanked by Marcus and a wall of silent, armed security. When the flashlights blinded the darkness and a voice demanded Pamela's surrender, James didn't move. The air exploded into a blur of shadows and heavy impact as the two teams collided in a brutal, wordless struggle for the property line. James stood his ground, a titan protecting his own, refusing to yield until the last of the mercenaries retreated into the night. By dawn, the digital floodgates opened and the evidence of Victor Vance's crimes saturated every news cycle from New York to California. As federal agents swarmed Vance's penthouse, the shadow that had haunted Pamela for years finally evaporated. In the quiet sanctuary of the Murphree estate, James watched the sunrise, no longer a man of cold iron, but a father made whole. Beside him, Sophie let out a soft, melodic laugh, her small hand reaching for Pamela's. The silence was gone, replaced by the promise of a future where they were no longer hiding, but finally, truly home. If you believe that courage and justice are worth more than any fortune, don't let this story end here. Subscribe and notify, join our dedicated community, and turn on notifications to never miss an emotional saga. Share the story. Pass this on to anyone who needs a reminder that the truth is worth fighting for. Join the debate. Tell us in the comments, what would you risk to protect a silent voice? Your support ensures these powerful stories of transformation continue. Subscribe now and stand for the truth.